Venezuela, a country with a population of about 30.5 million people, has lost something like 7 to 9 million people, depending on which numbers you use, to a refugee crisis that began about a decade ago in 2014, and which has since become the largest ever in the Americas and one of the top 10 all-time biggest outflows of people from a region in recorded history, just under the outpouring of people from Bangladesh into mostly India, which I mentioned in last week's episode during the country's war of independence from Pakistan, and just above the number of people who have fled Syria over the course of its now 13-year-long civil war. That means Venezuela has lost around a quarter of its total population in the span of just 10 years. The spark that lit the fire of Venezuela's refugee crisis was not a civil war, but a political movement called the Bolivarian Revolution, which is named after Simón Bolívar, who is renowned and respected throughout the region for leading the area's independence movement against Spain. This revolution was kicked off by a soldier-turned-politician named Hugo Chávez, who has long worked to implement what he calls Bolivarianism across the Americas, which calls for a nationalistic, socialistic state of affairs in which Hispanic governments would work together, these governments owning the most vital aspects of industry and the economy according to a socialist model. It calls for self-sufficiency driven by that state-owned nature, the government reining in the hoarded excesses of capitalism-oriented competition, basically, and it calls for the elimination of corruption and the expulsion and exclusion of what it calls colonialist forces, alongside the equitable distribution of resources to the people. It's a riff on other socialist and communist models that have been tried, basically, with a South American twist, but it has many of the same implications for day-to-day realities, including the supposition that everything is owned and run by the people, though generally what that means in practice is a pseudo or full-on police state meant to keep those outside enemy forces, which are blamed for anything that goes wrong, from meddling in local affairs. And it also tends to mean a lot of self-enrichment at the top, those in charge of the police state apparatus, and all the state-owned businesses giving a lot of handouts to their friends and family, and generally becoming quite wealthy, while the rest of the population becomes increasingly disempowered and impoverished. This is not the way these sorts of models necessarily have to go, of course, and it's not the way they're meant to go, according to their own ideals and tenets as stated. But historically, this combination of claimed goals seems to lead in that direction. And in Venezuela's case, we have seen that same trend play out once more. The Bolivarian Revolution putting Chávez at the top of a system predicated largely on oil wealth, which allowed Chávez to reinforce his hold on power, that reinforcement including the jailing, threatening, and harassing of political opponents, and keeping the main opposition party mostly out of power despite their widespread popularity. In 2013, Chávez's vice president, Nicolás Maduro, stepped into the role of acting president when Chávez had to step aside due to cancer complications. He then won an election that was triggered by Chávez's death by less than 1.5% of the vote, though his opponent claims there were irregularities. The National Election Council carried out an investigation and said that the vote was legit, and Maduro became president later that year. The seeming illegitimacy of that election, though, remains a huge point of contention between the political forces in Venezuela, and in the years since, the government has engaged in what's often euphemistically called democratic backsliding, which means those in charge are implementing increasingly authoritarian policies in order to maintain control and keep themselves at the top, at the expense of democratic norms and values, like, among other things, free and fair elections. All of which has been bad for morale and for locals' sense of power within their own governmental system, and this is what led to the beginning of that exodus out of the country. But this has all been maintainable to a certain degree because Venezuela is sitting on the world's largest known oil reserves, and has thus been able to just keep pumping oil and expanding their own pumping capabilities, and that has allowed them to fail across a lot of other metrics, but still keep things afloat. The average person doing just well enough that they had something to lose if they stepped too far out of line, challenging the government in some way, for instance. This increasing monofocus on oil and other raw materials like gold, though, became a huge issue when a series of what are generally considered to be ham-fisted policy decisions, including the perpetuation of abundant and generous fuel subsidies for citizens and local businesses, left them with wild levels of inflation that led to an intentional devaluation of the country's currency as part of an effort to address that inflation, but which ultimately just ended up making things worse. The government also took out a bunch of debt to help increase their oil pumping capacity, and that combination of debt, a weak currency, and a local economy that had done away with basically everything except oil left them without everyday fundamentals, including food, alongside issues like burgeoning disease rates, child mortality rates, high levels of crime and corruption, and a whole lot of violence, politically motivated and otherwise. As of mid-2024, nearly 82% of Venezuela's population lives in poverty, and 53% of the population lives in extreme poverty, unable to afford enough food and slowly starving to death. Maduro seems to have won another election in 2018, though that vote is even more widely considered to be a farce than the one in 2013. And though outside governments like the US supported the ascension of opposition candidate Juan Guaido, who seems to have actually won, that support did not lead to any real change within Venezuela, though it did lead to more sanctions by the US and its allies against the Venezuelan government and many higher-ups within that government, of which there were already quite a few. And the weight of these sanctions on their oil industry in particular have made it very difficult for Venezuela to openly sell their oil on the international market at full price, which has further deteriorated their economic situation. There was some hubbub within the Trump administration in 2020 that a military option, like a full-on naval blockade, to keep under-the-table black market oil deals that dodge US sanctions from occurring might be on the table, as Maduro was proving resilient to other less forceful attempts to dethrone him, like the aforementioned sanctions. But nothing came of that, and a few years later the Biden administration offered to ease sanctions on Maduro's government and to begin the process of normalizing relations between the two countries if Maduro agreed to have a fair and free election, letting Venezuelans decide whether to keep him or not, but an actual election, not a rigged election that they call a fair and free election this time around. What I'd like to talk about today is how that election played out and the local and international response to its results. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. Learn more about Let's Know Things, subscribe to receive free email updates, and or become a supporter to receive monthly bonus episodes at letsknowthings.com. Some of that promised loosening of sanctions began well before the election, which took place at the tail end of July 2024, and that allowed Venezuela to reap some profits from selling oil, gas, and gold that would have otherwise been tricky to get on the global market. But while Maduro made a few gestures at allowing things to be free and fair, and released some political prisoners as demanded, he figured out a way to justify keeping his main opposition, a woman named Maria Corina Machado, who has been incredibly popular with Venezuelans, from being on the ballot. So she picked someone to basically serve as a stand-in for her and her party, a man named Edmundo Gonzalez, to run instead. Official numbers released by the government indicate that Maduro won about 52% of the vote and will thus remain in office. According to data and analysis from outside watchdog groups, however, the voter numbers released by the government are highly suspect, the numbers giving every indication that they were falsified. Evidence, including 2/3 of the tally sheets that the electronic voting machines printed out after polls closed on Election Day, provided by Gonzalez's opposition alliance to some of those watchdog groups and to journalistic entities including the New York Times and the Associated Press, suggest that Maduro probably only got something like 31% of the vote, while Gonzalez, and through him Machado and her party, received around 66%. A landslide victory, double the votes, more than double the votes, if those numbers are even close to accurate. And there's additional evidence that they are, as that is very similar to the results tallied by an independent exit poll on Election Day. Despite that evidence, the Venezuelan Election Authority has confirmed Maduro's re-election, saying that Gonzalez only garnered 43% of the vote, and the governments of Venezuela's allies like Russia, China, and Iran have also recognized these results as valid. Though to be clear, China, Russia, and Iran are all renowned for their Potemkin elections that have all the trappings of a democratic act, but which are largely ceremonial and always predetermined, at least to some degree, even if they claim to take the will of the people into account. So this is a group of governments that regularly run rigged elections who are vouching for the legitimacy and apparent non-riggedness of an election that keeps their preferred authoritarian ally in power. Do with that information what you will. On the other side, we have a slew of mostly Western nations that have come out against the results, saying, with varying degrees of certitude, that there's abundant evidence these election results were faked and that Gonzalez is the actual winner. The US government is included on that list, and many of Venezuela's neighbors, some of whom have recently spoken about their concerns related to Maduro's belligerence in the region and seeming intention to rig the vote in his favor, like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. They have said they want the Venezuelan government to release the full details of the vote so everyone can see and analyze the totality of data the government is supposedly working from and deriving their numbers from. Some of Maduro's allies and former allies, and some hardcore supporters of his predecessor Chávez, have likewise told Maduro he needs to release the baseline voter data to clear things up. Maduro has said, instead, he will have the country's Supreme Court audit the results. But this is being seen as a sidestep move by Maduro, as the court was recently packed with Maduro loyalists and is therefore not capable of undertaking an independent, unbiased review of the data. Like many other aspects of the country's government, the High Court is basically in Maduro's pocket. Maduro is also saying that the US and other longtime enemies of his government are trying to rig the election against him, and that he cannot release detailed vote counts because the National Electoral Council is under attack, including cyber attacks, and they are not able to provide these numbers right now because of that aggression. Though he has provided no evidence to support this supposed reason, these attacks, that he cannot make any of this information public. So while it is not 100% certain what has happened here, it's looking a lot like what happened in the last election. Maduro pulling out all the stops to muddle what information is being released, looking like he's playing ball whenever possible, but within a context in which he can make it look that way without facing any real risk of being challenged. And it would seem that he has leveraged the powers of state once more to lock in his position at the top for another 6 years minimum. In addition to those international governments and groups calling foul on his actions, we are seeing widespread protests against the government and these alleged results across Venezuela, and in a few cases, these protests have become violent. The government supports groups of loyalists called colectivos, giving these groups of civilians weapons and telling them to go attack peaceful protesters, and that can spark this kind of violence at these events. Though formal police and military forces have also seemingly attacked protesters pretty brutally, and that has triggered pushback in some cases. The government is accusing foreign nations like the US and immigrant groups of causing this violence, saying these are special covert operations meant to make the government look bad and attack good, loyal, wholesome citizens, basically, which is a common authoritarian move in these sorts of circumstances. And police and military forces have been rounding up protesters and hunting them down afterwards, arresting thousands of people so far for what they are calling anti-government or terrorist activities. This has led to a situation in which there are still protests, and the opposition is still pushing hard against these supposed results, but many people involved have been pulling down their online personae, their social media profiles and posts, and not sharing photos and videos because they're worried the government will send people to their homes to black bag them and take them away, which is apparently happening around the country right now to folks from the opposition party, but also everyday people who went to a rally or protest. The question now is whether the outcome this time around will be any different than it was in 2013 and then again in 2018, when Maduro first stepped into power and when he retook power. Something the opposition has this time, but which it did not have in those previous elections, is Maria Corina Machado, the candidate who was booted from the ballot and who had to select Gonzalez to run in her stead. Machado has become a public figure of almost religious significance in the country, and her star has arguably only gotten brighter the more Maduro has pushed back against her ability to participate in the formal processes of state. She won 90% of the vote to become the head of the opposition coalition last October, and she's been in politics since 2004, when she promoted a referendum to recall then-President Chávez, and that effort earned her a conspiracy charge. In later years, as she continued to hold various political roles, she was accused of corruption, disqualified from holding public office, accused of being involved in a plot to assassinate Maduro, all of these accusations seemingly false, and only applied to keep her from causing trouble, by the way. And then, after nearly a decade staying out of the spotlight, she became a candidate in that party primary that she won so handedly, which in turn led to her being banned from running for office for 15 years, all of which just seems to have further empowered her with everyday Venezuelans, even though she cannot be on the ballot herself. She seems to be a lot more popular and to hold a lot more sway than Guaido, the candidate who was held up as the actual victor of the 2018 election and treated as such by several other governments in subsequent years. Diehard fans of Machado also seem to have a bit more zeal than Guaido's followers did, which could mean if the government acts against her or Gonzalez, as they've threatened to do, and which both candidates seem to be almost daring the government to do, having shown up in public a few times despite those threats to lock them up, or worse, since the election. If something like that happens, that could result in even bigger and potentially more destructive and violent protests because of that zeal, despite her calls for nonviolent opposition against what seems to have been a grave injustice. The world has also changed quite a bit since 2018, and many of Venezuela's neighbors, even those that would have previously stayed carefully neutral in this election, have outright recognized Gonzalez as the winner, including Uruguay, Argentina, and Peru, among others. This changed world could also bring more support for Maduro, though, as their global allies, the Russias, Chinas, and Irans of the world in particular, are busily building a collection of relationships with governments that oppose the de facto hegemony of the US and Europe. And that is manifesting in all sorts of ways, including providing resources, trade, and misinformation and military support to other fellow travelers who are holding the authoritarian line against pushback from their democratic and close enough to democratic peer states. There's a good chance there will be more tumult in neighboring nations as a result of all this, most immediately in Colombia, as that is where the majority of Venezuelans who have left the country as part of that larger decade-long exodus have been going. And there's abundant indication that many people who held out, hoping this election would change something in Venezuela, and sticking around based on that possibility, are now planning to leave, now that Maduro has apparently managed to cling to power once more. There's a chance this could trickle into other nations' politics too, as many of those Venezuelan migrants who don't stay in Colombia end up heading north to the borders of the United States. And those borders have been at the center of the past several elections. And the new Democratic nominee for president this November, Kamala Harris, was tasked with handling border issues in the country when she was VP, at a truly tumultuous moment for those borders. So a surge in new migrants at the US's borders could lead to more criticism of her on that front, as her performance in that role is generally considered to have been not great. The Venezuelan military seems to be standing with Maduro on this so far, which means that it's unlikely the citizenry will have much of a chance of forcing the government to take them seriously and do anything about this seemingly rigged election, beyond protesting at such a scale and regularity that it messes with the government's ability to get anything done, which could at some point nudge those in positions of power within the military to take the citizenry's side. This is considered to be unlikely at this point, though, as Maduro has made sure to tie those leaders to him, giving them all sorts of monetary and business benefits, and arranging the country's military and intelligence services so that all of the agencies and people running them are tasked with watching each other as much as the other elements they're meant to actually defend against. Again, a common authoritarian tactic, as this can help stave off the potential for coups, no one willing to risk their own power to oust the person up top, and everyone feeling like they're always being watched, so they better not try anything. The most likely outcome, based on how things have gone previously at least, and how this has played out so far, is probably that this will remain a talking point internationally for a while. Protests will continue to bubble up and be tamped down, periodically becoming violent enough to warrant international news. But then in a handful of months, Maduro will have reinforced his position in power still further. Neighboring governments will be forced by practicality to reckon with his staying in power and will figure out ways to deal with him, even if not happily. And the exodus of citizens from the country will continue as the economy continues to get worse in most ways, though perhaps bolstered a bit in some ways by support from the Russia-China-Iran loose alliance. All of which, again, lacking some other X factor that changes things, will reshape the population and demographics of the region, while causing all sorts of economic ripples globally as well. The book I'd like to recommend today is called Nuclear War, a Scenario by Annie Jacobsen. I have been recommending this book left and right recently, in part because it's just so well written and so incredibly well researched, but also because it is absolutely terrifying, and that terror stems from what the book relates, which is a moment by moment, second by second in some cases, telling of what would happen if a nuclear weapon was launched, or if a convincing false alarm over a nuclear weapon were to be marked and it were to be treated like a launched nuclear weapon. The amount of damage, civilizationally, globally, to the entire species and every other species on the planet that could be caused within 20-30 minutes is staggering. This is something that I've always understood intellectually on some level, even to the point of being able to list off numbers and numbers of casualties and numbers of weapons in the world and how long things would take. But hearing it told in this way, and coming to recognize the rapidity with which everything we have ever done as a species, and everything that's ever happened on this planet, and everything that we could do, that we're capable of doing in the future, could be ended. Nearly absolutely, and absolutely for all practical purposes, forever. Reading about that evoked a visceral sort of terror in me that I hadn't experienced before reading a book. And again, this is all based on the way things are actually set up. What leads to what leads to what leads to what. Some of these things set on automatic triggers, many of them prone to misunderstanding or errors or flubs or human elements that it's hard to account for when we're planning out ways of tempering risks. There's just so much that could go wrong, and unfortunately, the way the world is set up right now, and seems primed to remain set up for the foreseeable future, leaves us prone to this kind of absolute outcome. Now, if any of this sounds interesting to you, if you too want to experience that level of visceral terror, consider picking up a copy of Nuclear War, a Scenario by Annie Jacobsen. You can subscribe to receive email updates, find show notes, and other such content, and support this show financially, receiving additional bonus episodes as a thank you at letsknowthings.com. Learn more about me and my work at Colin.io. Subscribe to my other news-focused podcast, One Sentence News, wherever you get your pods, or at onesentencenews.com. And say howdy on social media. I'm at Colin is my name on Instagram and Twitter, and Colin Wright on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Colin Wright, and I'll talk to you again next week.